Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, guys. So in this video, I'm basically going to do a review of a discussion that I just watched between CosmicSkeptic and William Lane Craig. So this discussion was about the Kalaam cosmological argument. If you haven't seen it already, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, the discussion started off talking about how you can go from a cause of the universe, right? To if the argument is correct, the argument goes something like premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the universe began to exist, and so therefore conclusion, the universe had a cause. And so how do you go from the universe had a cause to the universe had a transcendent personal cause that is close enough to what we would think of as God. And so they discussed that for a little bit. Alex brings up some objections basically to how, for instance, it would seem to imply that you would require a time before time if you have a personal creator who quote unquote freely chooses to create the universe at a particular moment. It's kind of like, okay, well, the way we normally think of as choice is that before I wasn't doing something and then after I chose to do something. So without a before and after, how do you really make sense of choice? That's an interesting question. Personally, I have to read more into it to see what Craig would say, but it wasn't really the focus of the discussion. They also discussed the difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite, and how you would basically the arguments against the existence of an actual infinite. CosmicSkeptic brought up the argument that if you can't have an actual infinite, well, isn't God an actual infinite? And Craig responded by saying that when we talk about God, we mean a simple, i.e., a non-composite being, and so his infinitude or his infinity would be qualitative and not quantitative. So that was the way he answered that. In any case, most of the discussion centered around premise one of the argument: everything that begins to exist must have a cause. So that's where the discussion focused on, and that's where I'm going to focus on here as well. The rest of it was just kind of some interesting backdrop. There were definitely some deeper discussions to be had regarding potential and actual infinites, regarding how to make sense of God and time, or this idea of a personal choice and other things like that, which I hope to see them explore in the future. Basically, Alex, or CosmicSkeptic, wanted to avoid the conclusion that, not wanted, but I mean, I'm saying as an intellectual endeavor, he was seeing if there are some routes, let's say some options, to escape the first premise: everything that begins to exist has a cause. And Craig was initially skeptical about this, but Alex built his case. And basically what he endorsed was a view called mereological nihilism, which means that everything that you think is a whole composed of parts, well, that is simply an imposition of your mind on reality. In reality, there are no parts, there are no composite parts. So, for instance, if you see a book, and you think, oh, there's a book, mereological nihilism would say, no, there isn't a book there. You see, that's your mind imposing order on the external world. In reality, all you have there is the parts of the book, i.e., the let's say the pages and the cover, right, that make the book up. But then you'd say, oh, well, actually the book and the cover are themselves made up of parts. Let's say they're made up of molecules. Okay, well, actually those molecules are themselves made up of parts. So the point is that you keep working down this way to say that anything that you think of as a whole that is made up of parts is illusory. It's the mind projecting onto reality that there's a whole there. Really, all there are going to be are fundamental, simple particles that exist out there, and everything else is an imposition of the mind onto reality. And so if this is the case, then the premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause, Alex is saying, well, look, we don't really know, because everything that we observe coming, quote unquote, into existence is really just a rearrangement of those fundamental particles. So, for instance, when we see a plant coming, beginning to exist, in the new season, a seed is planted and a plant grows, we think, oh, that plant began to exist. And as Craig rightly pointed out, you don't have to have an exact, moment of when that thing began to exist, but it's enough to say that, in the month of July, this flower began to exist, or this whatever plant began to exist. That's enough for us to think, okay, it has to have a cause. Now, so what Alex was saying was, or CosmicSkeptic was saying was, okay, we didn't really actually observe a flower coming into being. All we did was observe the rearrangement of molecules, right, into, flower-wise, you can say. And then it's our mind that projects onto that and says, oh, there's a flower. But in reality, all that exists are fundamental particles combined in different ways. Now, okay, so that's where they led the discussion. And so Craig said that he had 3 arguments for thinking that the first premise was true, i.e. that everything that begins to exist has a cause. One of them was based on induction, meaning everything that we see begins to exist has a cause. The other, and then he had 2 metaphysical arguments. One of them is saying that you wouldn't, it would be inexplicable why something wouldn't just pop into existence at any moment. So why, for example, does a horse not just materialize here, or an Eskimo village, as Craig, gives the example? Why don't things just pop into being everywhere randomly, right? If things can come into being without a cause. And then the other metaphysical reason is it just seems like when you reason about it metaphysically, for something to come from nothing appears to be impossible, right? How could something come from nothing? So those were the 3 arguments he gave. But Alex, on his mereological nihilism view, would basically destroy the inductive support for the first premise. So in other words, the argument to support your premise, right? Because every premise also requires an argument to support that premise, like a pre-argument, you might think of it as. One of the arguments is based on inductive generalization, that we're observing this all the time. Well, actually, we haven't observed anything come into being. All we've observed is the rearranging of existing things, would be Alex's point. And so in reality, only one thing that we know of has actually come into being, which would be the universe itself, okay, at the point of the Big Bang. Or really, since there is no universe, it would just be the fundamental particles which came into being in the Big Bang. Since the universe itself as a whole, that would be a projection of our mind. Okay. Now, Alex also tries to deal with the second argument, one of the metaphysical arguments for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Namely, why don't things just pop out of nowhere, right? And if I remember correctly, what he tried to say there was that maybe it's only universes that can pop into being from nothing. So that's basically a summary of the arguments. And now I just want to give a critical analysis. And CosmicSkeptic said that he was going to think more about the implications of his view, because that was something that Craig pressed him on. He said, look, this is kind of like a crazy worldview that you have to accept. There's so much you have to give up in order to avoid the conclusion that the universe has a cause, and that cause is going to be personal, etc. You're having to go to extreme lengths here. So is that really a price tag that you want to pay here? I want to kind of, examine also where this kind of mereological nihilism will lead, and kind of offer some additional thoughts. That being said, I actually do think that mereological nihilism, why is that word so difficult to say? I do think that is actually the logical outcome of the scientific revolution, the outlook of the scientific revolution, which divides things into primary causes and or primary effects. How did they put it? Primary and secondary impressions. I forget exactly the way that Locke divides it, but the point is that like everything qualitative is simply in your mind, and everything quantitative is what really exists out there in reality. And so the logical outcome of this view is that form, right, what Aristotle would call the formal cause, is really just a product of the mind, and there is no formal there are no forms out there in reality. So I actually do think that this is the logical outcome of the scientific revolution, but I also think it's going to lead us to some very absurd conclusions, such that we can conclude that this view is false, or at the very least, well, let's see where we get. Let's throw in some arguments here and then see where we can get. First, I want to start more broadly, and then we're going to narrow it down, inshallah. So Alex said, what if it's just universes that can come into being without a cause? And so maybe there are universes popping up all the time, and we don't know about it because they're outside our universe. The first question I'm going to have is, how can something which does not yet exist have a property, such as the ability to come into being from non-being without an efficient cause? Okay, so any property whatsoever, including the property of being able to come into being with no efficient cause, would, in order for it to be real, would have to be a property of something already existing, right? So, people might think, okay, well, what about like something like Sherlock Holmes? I can talk about Sherlock Holmes being, for example, a detective, whatever. That's like a description or a property, whatever. He's a man, he's tall, whatever it is. The thing is, Sherlock Holmes, quote unquote, exists conceptually, right, in the mind of a human being. It doesn't exist out there in the world. In other words, this would be part of the conceptual realm. What Alex is proposing is not something that's existing in the conceptual realm, but something that's actually there in reality. And so what I'm wondering is, okay, if this thing doesn't exist, how can it have a property? Nothing can't have a property. It is propertyless. It is the absence of anything. So the idea that the universe can have a property before it exists seems to be putting the cart in front of the horse, because it would seem to suppose some sort of Platonic realm or some kind of intellect in which the universe would first exist and then like boom, pop into being. But I don't think that's what Alex is trying to say, and I think that that's also going to lead to a whole different discussion. And I also think that might even qualify as an efficient cause in that case. So, the counterexample doesn't really work. Now, if universes can come into being without an efficient cause, right, it would logically follow that nothing prevents a non-existent universe from becoming existent, and therefore there must be an actually infinite number of universes. Okay, let me break that down. Let's just assume for a second, okay, it's correct. Universes have this property where they can just come into being with no efficient cause, no problem. What that would mean is that there are an infinite number of universes, because they can come into being with no efficient cause. So what is preventing them from coming into being? There's literally nothing preventing them from coming into being. And so therefore, not only can they be popping into being all the time, they actually must be, right? Because there's an infinite number of possible universes, you see? And so they would have to be popping into being all the time. And since there's an infinite number of them, you get what I'm trying to say here. There's nothing to prevent an infinite number from just... An infinite number would have the property of being able to come into being from non-being with no efficient cause. And so we would think that is actually the case. Now, if that is actually the case, right, then remember back when I talked about how, William Lane Craig said for the second premise that the universe began to exist. There are a number of philosophical arguments that he uses to support this, one of which is that an actual infinite cannot exist. But if an infinite number of universes are popping into being, right, possibly at every moment, an infinite just every moment, right, then that would imply that an actual infinite does exist. So we have to choose here. Is Craig's argument about actual infinites correct or incorrect? Because if it's correct, it's not only going to protect the second premise, it's going to protect the first premise, at least in its weaker form, namely that if the universe, Craig reforms the argument in a softer way at some point in the discussion, if you guys saw the discussion, which I recommend before watching this, of course, that, you know, that he reformulates it in this way, that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Okay, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So let's take that first premise, that if the universe began to exist, then the universe must have a cause. That's going to be protected by the infinite, by the impossibility of an actual infinite argument, because if the universe can come into existence without a cause, or if universes in general, if this is a general property of universes, then you would have to have an actual infinite exist. I hope that argument makes sense. I think there are a number of ways that maybe Alex could get around it by just saying, no, it's not all universes, it's just this universe, or a certain subset of universes have this property, others don't. But this really seems like ad hoc question begging, like why would this universe or a certain class of universes have the ability to come, that are limited in number, happen to have the ability to come into being from nothing, but not others? And then why couldn't you have just an infinite number of instantiations of like the same universe? Let's say it's only this universe that can come into being from nothing. Why wouldn't you have an actually infinite number of instantiations actually coming into being with no efficient cause? Just like the same universe repeated infinitely, since apparently it can come into being with no efficient cause. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So you can try to get around it, but it seems to me like you're going to end up, as soon as you say, yeah, it can come into being with no cause, you're going to end up with an actual infinite. So it seems to me that if this is the case, what the opponent of the Kalaam cosmological argument is going to have to do is they're going to have to say that an actual infinite is possible. But if an actual infinite is possible, they've defeated the second premise, in which case it seems to me that you don't have to go to this extreme to try to get around the first premise. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like, what is the point of trying to argue that the universe can come into being without a cause, if in the end you've shown that potentially there is just an infinite regress, basically infinite pastime of universes, like this universe within another, or a a bang contraction, you just go back infinitely in time, right? So if the universe didn't begin to exist, then the problem is solved without having to say that something can come into being without a cause, which is surely the less intuitive of the two. So I hope the point that I'm making there is, I perhaps didn't express it as concisely as I would have hoped, but I hope you guys got the point that if universes can come into being without an efficient cause, there should be an actually infinite number of them, in which case the whole argument is gonna fall or die on whether actual infinites can exist or not. Okay, so the next point is this. If universes can come into being from non-being without an efficient cause, why do we not see universes popping into being within our own universe? Okay, so if you remember before, Craig was saying, look, if something can come into being without a cause, why is it that a horse doesn't just pop up here and an elephant there and whatever? And Alex's point was to counter this by saying, no, look, there are no horses his whole point was this, that only universes have the property of being able to pop into being with no efficient cause, okay? So if that's the case, then I don't understand how that precludes a universe popping into being within another universe. You see, what Alex is going to have to do is add more to his thesis, which is that, and this can only happen if it's, outside the boundaries of a given universe. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, okay, universes can pop into being without any efficient cause. We're in this universe right now. Why is the universe not popping out here and behind me and there and there? Like, why are universes just not popping up within our own universe? like a universe within a universe. What's wrong with that? What Alex would have to say is, no. Universes have the property of being able to pop into being with no efficient cause, so long as it is not within the boundaries of another universe. Again, why think this? We have no metaphysical reason to think. It's a very odd assertion, if you get what I'm trying to say. First of all, it's just an assertion. There's no evidence for it, and it doesn't really even make sense. Like, why would that be the case? Okay. So you'd have to say that the existence of one universe precludes another coming into being within its own boundaries. But if something can come into being without an efficient cause, there should be no condition on its coming into being. And so therefore it shouldn't be possible to have preventative conditions. So for example, let's say I say that I ask the question, why doesn't this flower, okay, come into existence on my carpet? You might say, okay, well, the reason is because the flower requires soil to come into being, right? Like the seed, whatever, it needs to be planted in soil to come into being. The carpet is now preventing, the soil there. Like instead of soil, you have a carpet, and so the seed is not going to produce a flower. The flower is not going to come into being. But if I said flowers can come into being with no efficient cause whatsoever, then actually my question would be valid. Whether in soil or carpet or granite or in the middle of the sky, if I said why is a flower not coming into being here, it would be a legitimate question. Why? Because we just asserted that flowers do not require efficient causes to come into being, and so therefore it shouldn't require soil, it shouldn't require carpet, it shouldn't require anything. Okay, so if you take that analogy with the flower, right? If you take that analogy with the flower, because remember, on Alex's views, they're on the view that Alex is putting forward for the purpose of argument, for the sake of argument. There are no flowers; there are just fundamental particles arranged flower-wise. No problem. So, why are fundamental particles arranged universe-wise not just popping into being anywhere? Because we're saying it doesn't require an efficient cause. You see, so even if somebody tried to assert that no, it can only happen outside the boundaries of this universe and is therefore conveniently unobservable. The point is that the very metaphysical proposition that it does not require an efficient cause would seem to make it the case that that adding that additional condition wouldn't make sense. It would be like saying a flower can come into being with no efficient cause, but it also needs soil. It'd be like, wait a second, you just said it doesn't need an efficient cause, so why does it need soil? Why can't it come into being on the carpet? Okay. Okay. So also, this is just a point that I wanted to make, is that they were Alex was a bit imprecise when he said that, you could, like, he put forward the idea that you have a universe coming into, that only universes can come into being without an efficient cause. And the reason is because there is no universe on his view. That's a whole. That's, if we're doing mereological nihilism, all we have is the fundamental particles, okay? So that's just a point of clarification. But if that's the case, that fundamental particles can come into being, okay, then we have another problem. Why is it that fundamental particles arranged universe-wise, horse-wise, Eskimo village-wise, pink elephant-wise, why can't they pop into being in this room, right? Why can't they pop into being randomly? So this is a question that Alex is going to need to answer for his view to make sense. So I don't think he solved the problem, you see? Before, Craig was saying, why can't a horse just pop into this room if something can come into being with no efficient cause? Alex said, well, it's because there is no horse there really, all there are fundamental particles, and then said, the only universes can come into being without an efficient cause. That was the proposal. But actually, the universe is like a horse. It's a thing. Really, what he should have said is that only fundamental particles can come into being with no efficient cause. But if fundamental particles can come into being with no efficient cause, then why do they have to be arranged universe-wise? Why can't they be arranged horse-wise or Eskimo-wise? In which case, Craig's initial point remains. You see? I hope that made sense. Okay. last point is this: if mereological nihilism is true, then that would imply that I don't exist, meaning the subject who is projecting these, the holes, the form onto reality, that the subject wouldn't exist. Okay. So what CosmicSkeptic said is that he said, look, the whole, right, is mind imposed on reality, the form. But on materialism, right, which is presumably his view, a person himself, like a human being, and he alluded to this when he said that the material that makes up a human being existed, let's say, in the Jurassic era. A person himself is just the composition of his parts, i.e., the mind is just the brain. This is what materialists believe. They think that the mind is reducible to the brain. Okay? In which case, we now have an incoherence emerge. Okay, this is what I'm proposing here. That I think we have a logical incoherence, which is this. That what the mereological nihilist needs to say is that the mind is mind imposed. Okay? The mind is mind imposed. But how could the mind impose the mind on itself if it doesn't exist? Okay, so I'm going to say that again. So when I say that the mind is mind imposed, that means that there really is no such thing as a mind, right? That it is a product of the mind to think that there is a mind. In quote unquote external reality, there is no mind. Okay? In external reality, there is no mind. If we're saying the mind just is the brain, and the brain just is its fundamental particles, that there really is no brain, all there are fundamental particles, where is it that you're getting the mind from that? Okay, so let me put it this way. It might be easier to think of this first if you're thinking about observing another person's mind. Let's say you have another human being in front of you, okay? What the mereological nihilist is saying, look, this person's mind, the materialist is saying, this person's mind just is their brain. This person's brain just is fundamental particles. There is no brain. So if there is no brain, there is no mind. You see that? If there is no brain, there is no mind, because they just said the mind is the brain. That's what the materialist believes, that there is no, substance dualism or what do you call it? or heliomorphic understanding of the world. It's just matter out there. Okay, so no problem. The mind is the brain, but the brain doesn't exist. The brain is, you impose, what he is saying is that you as the observer of that other person, you are imposing on the fundamental particles this structure, which is the brain. You see that? And so you're even attributing to this person having a brain is just an imposition of your mind. And so therefore your imposition of this person having a mind is an imposition of your mind. You see that? Because he doesn't actually have a brain, and if the brain just is the mind, he doesn't have a mind either. That's something that you're imposing on. All there is the fundamental particles. So I hope you guys got that for the other person, okay? For the other person, if that makes sense. Now come to yourself. Okay, what are you? The mereological nihilist is going to say the same thing. The materialist, right? The materialist, mereological nihilist is going to say this: your mind just is your brain, but your brain is itself would itself be an imposition of your mind on fundamental particles. All there are fundamental particles. So if that's the case, you would first have to have a mind to be able to impose on the structure of the fundamental particles a brain which is equal to the mind. Does that make sense? Maybe I'll have to review that one. I don't know if it's coming off right, or if I'm articulating it correctly. But the idea is there in my mind. I don't know if I'm able to make it reach you guys. But if you understand it for the other person, then I don't see how it would be different for your own self, right? And the reason why this reduces to incoherence is because it requires the mind to be ontologically prior to itself. Okay, so the whole point of the mereological nihilist is he's saying, look, when you're looking at another person's brain, okay, the fundamental particles are ontologically prior to the mind's imposition of the brain. What's actually there in reality is the fundamental particles. My mind is now imposing on that a brain, and then that brain just is the mind. So when it comes to my own mind, it would be the same thing. That my mind is actually just a brain, but the brain really is just fundamental particles. Okay? So if that's the case, if there is no brain, as we just said, there is no brain, that's an imposition of my mind. All there are fundamental particles. That means that I can't have a mind unless the mind is something other than the brain, in which case we're done with materialism. In which case materialism is getting out of the way. So I guess my claim would then be that materialistic mereological nihilism would appear to reduce to self-contradiction. It would require the mind to be ontologically prior to itself, which is impossible. It would imply that the mind doesn't exist, or maybe that's the other option that you would have, is that the mind doesn't exist. But you know, you are, like any person would be more certain about the existence of their own consciousness and their own conscious experience than they would be even about the external world for you to take this view. So that it just seems absurd to me. Like, it would make more sense to just say I am the only thing that exists than it would be to think that you don't exist, that your mind is an illusion or whatever, which again is a contradiction, because an illusion has to take place within a mind. Okay, so those were basically the points that I wanted to make in this regard. If you guys liked it, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and tweet it at, or whatever, however you get it, to CosmicSkeptic. Send it to him, and maybe if enough of you guys do it, then he'll see this, and it'll be of benefit for him to think about some of the implications that I've tried to draw out here. My apologies that this wasn't more clear. It was very clear in my mind, but in trying to articulate it, I may have fumbled somewhat. So, if I have, let me know in the comments and I can clarify, inshallah, in another video. I also wanted to just make a side note here, namely that I recently saw a video by Muhammad Hijab in which he was kind of justifying his harsh behavior towards CosmicSkeptic. Now, I do think it's important for people within our own community to hold people in our community to standards, or to point out, when something is lacking. And I personally do not feel that the way that Muhammad Hijab has been treating CosmicSkeptic has been at all appropriate. That he's basically put him in the same category as a clown like David Wood, okay? As a clown who lacks all academic merit and is basically there just to insult and belittle and mock the Prophet and Muslims and so forth. And he justifies putting Alex in that category on very flimsy grounds. It's very obvious, I think, to anybody who's watched enough of CosmicSkeptic's videos that on the whole you would categorize him as a respectful atheist. Now, nobody's perfect, so okay, maybe he had his slips. The other thing is you have to distinguish between an offensive opinion and an intentional mocking and a vicious attack that is coming from the wrong place. And for example, Muhammad Hijab made a very big deal out of Alex saying, mentioning, that the Prophet mounted and abused, Aisha. Okay, that was the phrase that he used. And in my view, it's like, look, you were born and raised in a liberal society. You obviously know that they have a large amount of moral indignation to the idea of a minor engaging in sexual activity, right? This is like a sacred cow for them, right? This is like one of their gods, right? The mushrikeen of Mecca had like Lat and Uzza. The liberals of today have very specific rules about sexual freedom and individuality and whatever. So they have their sacred cows as well, okay? In my opinion, don't get me wrong, I find the opinion offensive, but I think it was a mild way of expressing the moral indignation that people born in a liberal society, people with a liberal worldview have towards that kind of thing. And I think we as a community need to distinguish between an offensive opinion and a person who is trying to be vicious in their attacks. And I feel that Muhammad Hijab conflated these two, and that he needs to understand that yes, people who are non-Muslims have offensive opinions to us, but that does not mean that every person with an offensive opinion is purposely trying to mock and deride us. So I don't know, maybe this is a topic for a different video. I've seen enough of CosmicSkeptic to not, at least at this point, to not put him in the same category as David Wood. And I think that's an absurd thing to do. And I think that Brother Muhammad Hijab needs to get his act together and to not, put people in the same category and to treat them the same way when they're clearly not, in my view. Okay, that's it for now. So yeah, like, share, subscribe. Thanks for tuning in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.